Welcome to POC Stories. Today I am with Bhavani, and we are going to talk about the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, affected by food shortage and fuel, but also high inflation and blackouts. So thank you, Bhavani, for accepting the interview. And could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you for having me. My name's Bhavani Fonseka. I'm a lawyer and researcher based in Colombo, Sri Lanka.
Okay. And so could you explain for people who have no idea about what's going on in Sri Lanka, shortly, what's the situation?
Yeah, very briefly, what we are going through is both a political and economic crisis, and it stems from the fact that we have very limited foreign reserves, and as a result, there's shortages of food, medicine, fuel, gas, and a whole list of essential items. And due to the shortages, there are long lines that are forming to get this. And not just long lines, but there's also some things cannot be found. So the doctors associations and other hospitals have come out publicly saying they're unable to do certain surgeries because medicine and what's needed is unavailable. Things like milk powder and particular brands are not available. So really, we are facing a really crisis point in terms of economic hardship faced by the people. But we also have a situation where, due to the government introducing particular policies, food security issues, because there was a fertilizer ban that was imposed last year that has impacted rice harvest and other vegetable harvest, and also production such as tea, which is a key revenue generation sector. So really, it's kind of multiple hardships faced by the people.
And so what could be the main reasons for this crisis? Is it about like the mismanagement of the government, the family rule, or is it other reasons do you have in mind?
So it's a combination. I mean, in November 2019, the president was elected, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and he was elected on a platform of economic prosperity, stability, security. So there's a lot of ambitious promises made by him. Soon after he took office and the government took office, they introduced massive tax cuts, which benefited certain groups, certain classes, but hugely impacted the revenue of the government. So that was late 2019. Then the pandemic hit, and as a result, the pandemic had an impact in terms of tourism sector and other sectors. And Sri Lanka is very dependent on tourism in terms of revenue as well. So there were multiple reasons for impacting this situation, but really largely it's mismanagement and not having a plan from this government. So, 2019, the tax cuts, there was criticism even at that time, and experts were saying this was going to have an impact in Sri Lanka. The pandemic was 2020, but 2022, we're still struggling. So there doesn't seem to be a plan. So it's really knee-jerk reactions, policy incoherence, policy U-turns, and a combination that has led to this present situation.
Okay. And so you told me, for example, that you have regular blackouts daily. So how does it work? Do you have like a fixed time of electricity per day, or how does it work?
Yeah, well, it varies. I mean, there was a point in March where there were power cuts up to 13, 14 hours. That has reduced now to a few hours. So it's about 3-4 hours sometimes, 6 hours sometimes. It depends. The government entities that are in charge of it does indicate some kind of time allocation, but we've realized that that shouldn't be taken as a given, because also keeps changing, and sometimes suddenly there are power cuts. It's very hard to plan your day around such uncertainty, but it's also impacted different sectors, from the small businesses who are unable to afford a generator and this kind of complete ad hocness, but also things like education, health sector, a whole host of sectors that have been affected by these power cuts, and just kind of the uncertainty as to when really it's going to happen and for how long, though there's some information, it cannot be taken as a given.
Could you like give an example, like for example, for necessity products, for example, milk, sugar? I don't know if you could like tell the prices, that how did it increase in the last few months?
Yeah, so it's increased quite significantly. I mean, even recently, a few days ago, the bread prices were increased because fuel prices were increased, and bakery owners increased price of bread because they just can't sustain the old prices. So every commodity has been increased in the last few months, and sometimes threefold, sometimes twofold, to a point where, I mean, because the prices keep changing. I mean, tomorrow there might be an announcement and the prices will change. But to a point where people now sometimes don't try to even buy certain items because they're now considered, like milk powder for some is a luxury item now. And gas, they were going to say the gas cylinder was going to be from, it was about 2,500 rupees. Now they were saying it's going to be over 5,000, which is like more than double. So you have a range of essential items really that are increasing so much that people are now, some sections of society are giving up uh, meals. So it's, some are sticking to one meal a day, two meals a day, facing severe difficulties in purchasing some of these items. So a lot of people are struggling.
And is there like any assistance regarding this, for example, for low income classes, or from the government at least, to get basic products? Or
So, I mean, we have something called the Samurdhi. It's like a social security program, which is been there for a few decades, but it's very outdated and it doesn't match the cost of living at the moment. And it's inadequate, but also it doesn't cover certain sections of population, some of the vulnerable groups. It hasn't been updated recently. So with the pandemic, also the government did initiate certain schemes to assist some of the vulnerable. But in the last 2.5 years, what we've realized is these are not sufficient and not up to date. So the government did initiate a cash transfer of rupees 5,000, which barely covers some of the basic goods, considering how much it has increased. So there are attempts, but nothing that's comprehensive. There's a lot of questions in terms of how people are selected, if it's politicized, the patronage politics come in. So there's a lot of criticism that vulnerable communities are still struggling. At the same time, I must say citizens, I mean, individuals have come out and they are doing their own to support people as much as they can, but these are very much individual driven initiatives which are not sustainable, because I think everyone is struggling. So there has to be a comprehensive package that's given by the government.
okay. And do you think like there is like an increase of ethnic or religious tensions during the economic crisis, or if, for example, an ethnic group is more favored than another, or is it not the case?
Well, we haven't seen that kind of information to show that there is an ethnic or religious dimension. There's, of course, because of our own history. I mean, Sri Lanka has had cycles of violence. We had a near 3-decade war. There's been discriminatory policies towards minorities, both the Tamil and the Muslim communities. But in the recent crisis, I'm talking about specifically the economic crisis at the present moment, we have yet to see that ethnic religious dimension coming out. But there are, in the backdrop of the past, Sri Lanka's past, there are fears that these could come out and minorities could be targeted. So this is something we're watching. I mean, it's a very delicate thing, and anything could spark these things. So we need to also see if there would be discriminatory practices. There could be violence targeting minorities. There's been violence, I have to say, in terms of some of the protests, but that hasn't had the ethnic or religious dimension. Not yet. So I'm being very clear, this is a sensitive area that we'll have to see, but we haven't yet seen something spark that kind of discrimination.
Okay. And so I would like to know, how does it impact women, this crisis, for example, regarding menstrual products, or maybe other things that is not very talked about in the media?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say the gender dimension requires attention. I mean, even during the pandemic, this came about because of the lockdowns and the inability to go out and work. And that has, I think, continued. So there's already now documentation reports that indicate that women did face severe hardships as a result of the different issues as a result of the pandemic, including the economic. So those who were the breadwinners, those who were daily laborers, daily wage earners, face severe hardships. And that continued, those hardships have continued. And now with the cost of living increasing, the economic crisis in terms of difficulties in finding essential items, women are impacted. And this, I think, needs a careful study as to see how the pandemic has now continued. The challenges that came about from the pandemic has continued in this present economic crisis. I'm not aware of a study yet, but it's an evolving dynamic situation. But definitely, I would say, just by what we've seen in the recent past, women are affected. That said, we've had protests in Sri Lanka for several weeks now, and women are really at the forefront as well, very active, very much, vocal and pushing the issue of needing change. So there's hardships, but also very animated and very active in also asking for change.
Okay. And so regarding the protests, are they happening every day? And also regarding freedom of speech, is it affected? Is there any censor or?
So we've had protests, continuous daily protests since early March. And these are very much citizen-led protests, very organic, spontaneous. People just have come to the streets because of the hardships. In early March, it started because of the power cuts and the lack of essential items and the hardships faced by the regular people. And these started I went for many of these, and we started these as citizens' protests, very peaceful, just standing on the roadside and kind of saying, these are the difficulties and change is needed. Now that has really transformed into these massive protests that are happening across Sri Lanka. There's tens and thousands that gather in the heart of Colombo every day. I try to go every day, and these protests have been there this massive protest has been there for the last 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, and it's attracted really thousands. And it goes throughout the day, throughout the night. Protesters are camping there, and it's again peaceful. And just saying the president needs to go, the prime minister needs to go, there has to be change, there has to be accountability, but really peacefully calling for that change. Now, we've had a few instances where violence has been used against protesters by the government. So that's unfortunate. There's been a few instances. Last week, there was one instance where one protester was killed, which is unfortunate after all these weeks of peacefully protesting. It looks like, I mean, there is an ongoing investigation that live ammunition was used against protesters by the police. So we'll have to see how that investigation proceeds and what comes about it. But one person died, and it is unfortunate it got to that. But if anything, this kind of the violence or the tactics used by the state to try to suppress peaceful protests and dissent has got more people on the streets. People are just had enough, and they're coming to the streets in numbers, and it's just quite remarkable because we have not seen this kind of protest where it's involved so many people from across ethnic, religious, class dimensions. Everyone pretty much is on the streets.
And what do you think could be like the short-term, at least, solutions for this crisis?
So, I mean, the call from the protesters for weeks have been that the president and the prime minister and the government has to resign. And I can't see anything moving if that is not met, because the protesters are very clear in their demands. So the president needs to step down, the prime minister needs to step down. As a result of the protests, the cabinet did en masse resign on the 3rd of April, and a new cabinet was appointed. But people were not satisfied with that result. They kept saying the president and the prime minister needs to go, and these two individuals are from a particular family called the Rajapaksas. So the call has been very much go home Rajapaksas. You cannot ignore that demand. So that is one specific thing. And at the political level, finding a solution where there is stability, because there is no stability at the moment, very uncertain times. So, is there a caretaker government appointed? What kind of political frameworks can come in? So these are things that require a lot of attention to ensure the political stability of Sri Lanka. At the economic level, we need to look at how to provide for the people in addressing the short-term needs, but also the long-term needs. And long-term requires structural reforms, restructuring our debt. So all of those things need to be looked at. Now, the government has commenced talks with IMF, which should have commenced much before, but finally it has started. But it will take a bit of time to get that IMF support, and then also to be really aware IMF support could come at cost of austerity and other issues that require attention. But in the time being, also then looking at immediate assistance from whoever can come in on addressing some of the most urgent essential items. So if that doesn't happen, there is fear that people will starve, and there'll be greater hardships faced by the most vulnerable.